Welcome everybody to another episode of John Webster Film. I am your host, John Webster, and with me today is the absolutely fantastic Loren, aka Shakes of Thrones.
Hey everybody!
And we're going to be talking about the 1996 film version of Hamlet today, which was directed and stars Kenneth Branagh. And I've been so excited about this because this is actually one of my favorite movies. And admittedly, I haven't seen enough Shakespeare films. I've seen a couple, but this one just made me fall in love with the play. And I remember because I saw it in a college class, and it was one of the Shakespeare films that I saw that I remember thinking, everybody seems to be having such a great time in this movie. And I think that's what really spoke to me. But
That's true.
But why don't we just get started? Why don't you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your history with Shakespeare?
Yeah, so my name is Loren. I go by @Shakes of Thrones on Twitter. A lot of you, if you know me, you probably know me as a presence in the Song of Ice and Fire Game of Thrones fandom. In fact, I think this is my first stream where I'm not talking about A Song of Ice and Fire or Game of Thrones specifically. So it's an honor to just be talking about my first love, Shakespeare. I've really enjoyed Shakespeare film adaptations since I was a kid, and I remember seeing Branagh's Much Ado About Nothing as the first Shakespeare movie I ever saw. And I got into acting in Shakespeare youth festivals during the summer when I was about 10. And I was in a abridged version of Hamlet when I was 10. And there were only 5 of us. So I played Ophelia, but it was 2 hours long. And there were only 5 of us kids in the cast. And this has a full cast, full script, pieced together from all the known editions of Hamlet. And there are a few. There's more than just one published version of Hamlet from like the different folios and stuff. And this is 4 hours long. So Branagh puts everything in, leaves out nothing. It is a lot of Hamlet.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I know in the introduction to the film on the DVD, he calls it the Eternity version.
Oh, the Eternity version.
Because it seems to go on forever.
Yeah, it does. And there's an intermission too. So he knows it goes on for a really long time, and you're supposed to like take a break, get some food, go to the bathroom, treat it like it's a real play. Even most theatrical versions, on stage versions, do not do the entire play Hamlet. They're abridged somewhat. I think it actually works better to do this for a filmed version, because you can take more breaks and return to it when you need to. So it's just a treat that it's all there for us. Like, it's really exciting to watch it and be like, oh, wow, I never heard that line before, or that's a scene that I don't often see.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I believe I saw this for the first time when I was still in the midst of, it never really ended, but I was in the beginning, phase of my, Lord of the Rings, obsession, and watching the extended cuts on DVD. So at the time, I was all about longer movies. I was like, the longer the better. Let's just stretch it on. So I think that's why I was fully game for, watching a 4-hour Hamlet.
It's like the director's cut, except that he didn't cut anything in the first place.
Yeah. Although actually, when the movie was originally out, I know that there was a cut down version that was like 2.5 hours that they screened at some movie theaters, just because they didn't think everybody would go to see the full 4-hour version. Wow. Which I'm one of those people, like, if I had been a fan of this, of Hamlet back then, I probably would have gone in search of a theater that showed the full 4-hour version.
Oh, me too. Absolutely. I remember seeing it in the theaters, and I didn't even remember that it was abridged for most theaters. But yeah, this is one of the the 90s were such a great time for Shakespeare adaptations. It's like, I mean, there are good ones that are still coming out, but the 90s were like the golden age. Because I remember this was in 1996, and 1996 was the year that Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet also came out, which is, I mean, Branagh's Hamlet is great, but Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet is probably my favorite Shakespeare adaptation. We should do a stream on that someday. So if anybody wants to talk about that one, I'm game. But
yeah, it's funny because I know I saw that around the time that it came out. I can't say I was super enamored of it, but then again, I wasn't quite as into Shakespeare at the time as I am now. So I would definitely like to revisit that, especially since I'm a huge fan of Moulin Rouge. So.
Yeah, I think it holds up well. It's one of, there's some movies from, years past that you rewatch and you're like, ooh, this it's a little bit out of place now, but it holds up well. It's Shakespeare, so how can it not?
Yeah. So that's your so you would call that your favorite Shakespeare?
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's very, I mean, a lot of the words that I would use to describe this movie, it's visionary. It's just, it's like put in a modern setting, but it's not gimmicky, which is kind of a fine line to walk. It just feels, I don't know, it feels very spiritual in a way, just watching it. And I mean that in the truest sense of the word. Like, it just has the spirit of Romeo and Juliet and Shakespeare in it, even though it's in a modern setting. But we can talk about that at a later time. We can bring the focus back to Hamlet.
Yeah. So first, hold on. And now I've just realized that I didn't keep my outline open, so that'll be a problem. No.
There's an outline for this?
Well, sort of.
Okay.
A miniature outline. Yeah, I mean, I was going to start off talking about the characters and performances, but let's tackle the overall vision of the movie, because it's so different from any other version of Hamlet.
Sure, it really is. Yeah, I've seen a lot of different versions of Hamlet, and I by no means have seen all of them. And I've tried to rank them in my mind for which one is the best. I mean, this is definitely up there, but it's like trying to choose a favorite color, because it's Hamlet, and they all try to, everyone who does Hamlet puts their whole heart into it and tries to present it in a way that hasn't been presented before. But the thing is that Branagh goes above and beyond with this, and it's not like the typical gloomy, somber Hamlet that we see, Hamlet filmed through a dark lens. This is bright, shiny Hamlet. Like, everything is just luminous and bright and white and shining, and it's this beautiful palace instead of a craggy, dark castle that's shadowy and everything, which is what we see in the Mel Gibson version, which was filmed at Elsinore, and the Laurence Olivier version, which is filmed in all black and white. The David Tennant version is also has very dark tones to it, but Branagh's, it just literally lights up the screen.
I know that's what made the movie accessible to me, because I was very used to the idea of Hamlet being dark and gloomy, and there was just something about this that really invited me, and I was like, wow, somebody turned the lights on. And,
right.
And it's just and when they put out the DVD back in 2007, it just was such a beautiful remaster as well. So the colors were really brought out. Mm-hmm. It's just, the cinematography is absolutely gorgeous, and
costuming.
Yeah, the costumes and just the architecture itself. You have the main, I guess we'd call it a throne room, the main hall, where you mirrors all around, which must have been a nightmare to shoot in. I would have to think.
You would think.
But it's really great, because especially when you get to the to be or not to be scene, and Hamlet is literally talking to himself.
But he's doing it like as a performance too, because he knows that Claudius and Polonius are watching him behind that mirror. Like they've got.
Well,
like,
does he? Because at that point, because he's onto it once they make a noise and Ophelia looks over in that direction. But I think when he starts off, he's actually not aware. But I guess you could argue that he's probably acting in the event that he's always being watched.
I think he suspects it, and he just like really guesses. He's not sure which mirror it is, because I mean, like he knows for sure once Ophelia comes in, and he's looking around when she says certain lines. Oh, there's a plot here. Like there's somebody behind the curtain, the mirror. And I knew it all along, but he's like dragging her from mirror to mirror and opening them all up, trying to figure out which one it is. But at the beginning, I think he suspects and he just chooses one, and he happens to choose correctly. But there's a lot of room for interpretation in this movie. The other thing that I really like about this movie is the delivery of some lines and how you can't be sure about a character's motive, and how it even makes me think some things that I never even considered about the play. For example, and I know we're like jumping all over the place.
That's fine.
Like doing this chronologically.
It's gonna be great.
But like one thing that I just never considered, which I don't know, it's probably not true, but it's fun to let the imagination play, is how when Gertrude enters and talks about Ophelia's death and how she drowned, she's just talking about how she looked and how beautiful she was with the flowers and everything in the water, and how she made her watery grave so beautiful and everything. Like Gertrude is talking about it in a kind of mechanical, monotone voice, and I'm like, did Gertrude kill Ophelia? Did she do that?
Wow.
I know.
Okay, that's not something I ever thought.
No, and it's also something I ever thought until like just that delivery of the line, and I'm not even sure if that's something that I'm supposed to consider. But it like fires up my imagination so many ways in this movie, hearing a new delivery of lines or just seeing them delivered in a way that I hadn't before. And I mean, I think, well, she could have, because maybe she just took pity on this poor woman, because women are treated horribly in this movie, in this play. I mean, it would almost kind of make sense. So anyway, that's like jumping ahead.
Wow, that's like putting a whole new spin on things.
Sorry to just like blow up your world there.
Yeah. Wow.
And then I Googled it. I was like, has anybody ever had this thought? Did Gertrude kill Ophelia? Nobody ever has. So I think it's just me. So if I've just like changed the world for everybody here, you're welcome.
Yeah, and you mentioned the costuming, which is gorgeous, and I also think the costuming plays into how we interpret certain characters as well. I think the fact that we're going to talk a lot more about him, but the fact that Claudiuss is decked out in sort of bright colors throughout the film, it presents him not as immediately an evil guy.
Yeah, his Claudiuss is sympathetic, like probably the most sympathetic of Claudius's that I've seen in Hamlet. And I wasn't sure at first that I liked it. Like there's a lot in this movie, in this adaptation, that I'm like, do I like this? Do I like the bright, luminous Hamlet? Or am I like not okay with this? Do I like the Claudiuss that I kind of am more sympathetic to than I am to Hamlet? Or do I not like this? Because sometimes I am more sympathetic to him than Hamlet, because Hamlet can be like kind of a dick.
Well, it's funny because like I said, I mean, I had seen the Mel Gibson version before, which was probably the only other version of Hamlet I had seen at the time, and it was kind of one of those experiences where I enjoyed it, but I don't know that I fell in love with the story. But this one pulled me in so much that I think because it's the Hamlet that I fell in love with, that I'm immediately accepting of the vision of the film, and so stuff like I loved the fact that Claudiuss was sympathetic, and that you don't start off immediately pointing at him saying he's the villain. I mean, obviously we know because everybody knows Hamlet, but what I found interesting is you don't even necessarily, if you're coming to it the first time, you don't necessarily even know for sure that he's done anything wrong until the moment at the play.
Well, I mean, you mean the play within a play? Or the moment in the play when he's... Well, it depends on like what you're talking about, like the film adaptation where they actually show him pouring the poison in the ear and the flashback.
But that can be interpreted as that's what Hamlet's being told by the ghost. But it could be his imagining. But is the ghost reliable? Is it real? Yeah. Or could it even be, as Hamlet suspects, maybe a demon, feeding him false information? But at that moment at the play, when Claudiuss stands up and he has that reaction, that's the moment and up until that point, if you don't know the story, you could very well think that okay, the guy is a creep for marrying his brother's wife, but beyond that, he seems like a pretty good guy.
Yeah. And there's even like, I've seen Hamlet a bunch of times and I've read it, and I kind of forget each time, wait, did Claudiuss really kill King Hamlet? And it's not even the moment when he stands up at the play, because I'm like trying to always convince myself of these Shakespeare conspiracy theories, probably since being in the Game of Thrones, Song of Ice and Fire fandom, you tend to do that too. But like it's the moment where he's confessing and he's praying and he says, I've committed the primal sin of brother killing brother. So I mean, he did it. That's kind of him saying it. Like even at the play, you could say, well, he's standing up because he's outraged that Hamlet would accuse him of something like this. But when he's actually praying and speaking to himself in soliloquy and admitting it, for sure that he did it.
I didn't want to, like you said, we're kind of jumping all around, and I hadn't thought about talking about this yet, but since we're at that moment,
let's go for it.
Even if like you as an audience member are not convinced at that moment that he's actually done it, Hamlet certainly is, and I think that the way he's so pleased with himself after that may be one of my favorite moments of this film, because Branagh's comic timing is so on point. At that point, just the way he's, jumping around and laughing in the face of his friends, and then when he starts yelling at them and pointing the pipe, and then
I mean, Branagh is a comedian too, and that's also what I love about this movie, is that there are a lot of humorous moments in it. There's humor in Hamlet for sure, but this one, more than other adaptations, I feel like really play up humorous moments that we wouldn't see so much in subtle moments.
Yeah. And then, in that same scene when Polonius comes in off the side, he's like, God save you, sir. It's just bringing that out. He has so many classic line deliveries, and even like right after the encounter with his father's ghost, he starts, you wonder if he's actually being driven mad in that moment, or if he's already playing the part of being crazy, because he really goes all out with
he does. And I think that it's a good question, and one that I often ask myself when watching any Hamlet is Hamlet mad, or is he just manic? And is there a difference between the two that we're supposed to distinguish? Because we're shown another character who goes well and truly mad, which is Ophelia. And there's no doubt about that. Like, that is a different level of madness without any self-awareness or, thought of her own thoughts. And Hamlet is constantly thinking about the process of his own thought. And it's hard to believe that he's driven mad when he's so wrapped up in his thoughts and self-reflective and considering the implications of each move and the morality therein. And I don't completely buy that he's gone mad. Like, maybe there's a spectrum of madness. Mm-hmm. I'm sure we can argue that. And Ophelia's at the far end, and Hamlet's more above the middle, somewhere over here, but not way out there. So I don't know. And that question of whether he's mad, it plays into how much empathy I have for him. Because if he's not completely mad, I can never truly like Hamlet as a character for how he treats Ophelia. And I can never excuse what he does to her and what he says to her, given that he's so aware of his thoughts. Even if he has convinced himself of this logic that all women are evil because of his mother marrying Claudiuss so fast after King Hamlet died. I just can't get into it. It's really difficult for me.
Yeah. It's funny because you come back to this story at different points in your life. And I had, very strong feelings watching it this time around with regard to his treatment of Ophelia, especially since early on in his sort of planning of getting his revenge, he pretty much uses her to further his plot, so to speak, when he, we don't see the actual scene, but Ophelia tells of it, where he comes in acting mad towards her. And that's just, like I said, it's using her, and it's not fair at all to her. And
that's so interesting that we only hear her account of it. And that's probably the scene in which he's most like her, when she goes mad and she's all in disarray with, her hair's a mess and her state of dress and everything. And in that scene where she's describing to her father when Hamlet came to her bedchamber with his doublet all embraced and, basically looking like a bat out of hell, we can only imagine it. And I think that's to a purpose, because Shakespeare knows that what it is in our imaginations is going to be more than he can depict on stage, because he's still trying to preserve this version of Hamlet for us where he's kind of in his right mind, because it's his story. And as long as he's on stage, it's from his point of view. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I don't know if I went totally off the rails with that tangent, but
no.
Yeah.
Yes, I agree, Stephen. I'm almost ready just to turn the entire thing over to her, because
yeah, please don't. I won't know what to do. But I'll have to pour myself some gin if you do that, and then it'll be truly entertaining.
But let's go ahead and talk about, since we started talking about the cast, let's sort of just move through. We can start with Branagh himself. I know that you said you wanted to talk about some Branagh-esque moments.
Oh God, yeah. So I was going to make a list of most Branagh-esque moments. We could just say most Branagh moments, but I like most Branagh-esque because you have to admit he has a particular way of acting Shakespeare. He's an amazing actor, but he's always Branagh. And he's super dramatic and over the top, which is great because Shakespeare is super dramatic and over the top. So I think it's fantastic. But there's really one moment that sticks out to me, and it's the one that I was tweeting about. It's the scene that occurs right before the intermission that's built into the movie, where Branagh is with, or Hamlet, see, I'm already confusing them. Hamlet is with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, and they're about to go off to England, I guess, and they get news that Fortinbras is on his way to Denmark to ask to pass through land so that he can go and attack Poland for whatever whatever he's warring with Poland about. And Hamlet asks, what's this war with Poland about? And the envoy or whoever says, it's over land. It's a skirmish over some small piece of land. And Hamlet's like, it's amazing that humans fight over such little things and make such enormous deals out of little things. But then this spurs this monologue in Hamlet for this reflection on why he hasn't done the thing that he's set out to do, which is kill Claudiuss for murdering his father, because that's a very big thing in his life. And it's funny because he's diminishing wars compared to what he's experiencing internally over this huge thing that, arguably is driving him a little bit mad with avenging his father. And he just launches into this huge dramatic monologue, which is dramatic by itself if you read it. It ends with, from then henceforth my thoughts be bloody or they be nothing worth. It's kind of like the equivalent of a teenager just going up to their room and slamming their door, except I don't know, he's actually going to not do that anymore. He's actually going to go out into the world and take his vengeance and take what is his. But it's very emo nonetheless, the entire monologue. It's difficult to liken it to anything because we always liken so much to Shakespeare and Hamlet. But he says it with such gusto. And there's this patriotic music in the background, which Patrick Doyle has just composed so lovingly for this movie. And the camera is panning out and it just looks like Branagh is this romantic transcendental painting from the early 19th century, just loudly preaching about how he's going to kill his uncle who has left his father killed and a mother stained. It's so over the top, and anybody else could not have done it, but Branagh did it this way. If you guys look, it's my recommendation for the best scene. Not really the best scene because there's so many best scenes, but if you watch nothing else to get a sense of Branagh's adaptation of his play, watch that one.
See, I mean, that is my favorite moment. Also because I'm such a fan of big intermission moments, and that is just, and the music, it's funny that you say it's patriotic music.
It's patriotic. You almost expect to hear guns firing, it's the 1812s.
Because it is Hamlet's theme, and it's played at sort of different levels throughout the film. It's given softer moments, and then sometimes it's more romantic. And for that moment, and a couple others throughout the film, the orchestra just picks it up, and this big soaring piece of music.
Mm-hmm.
And,
soaring is a good word for it.
Yeah, and no, I love the moment. I almost maybe it says something about me that I completely take it seriously in that moment.
I started laughing
because I'm so wrapped up in it. But it's
also incredible and inspiring.
I can see that reaction.
Yeah,
I do wonder if I was familiar with that moment as more, reserved sort of speech, like it probably is, and in other films it'd be one thing. But I just remember watching that, and I was just in awe of the camera pulling back and the cinematic scope of the whole thing.
Yeah, I know. It's so good. And it reminds me, I liken it to a painting because it reminds me of a specific painting that is very emblematic of the whole romantic transcendentalism period in art during the early 19th century, which is when this adaptation is kind of supposed to be set. And that painting is called Wanderer Above a Sea of Fog by Caspar David Friedrich. It's really famous. Probably a lot of you have seen it before. It's like this guy in, all black, painted from behind, looking like he's standing on some icy hill, just like overlooking, or icy mountainous region, overlooking this huge expanse of nature. And I think that's to a purpose, because a lot of that art from that time period is supposed to be about man, like looking out on nature and how big it is and how small he feels, and also sort of contemplating his own inner nature. And we get that a lot in Hamlet, which is so ahead of its time philosophically and introspectively and psychologically. I mean, it inspired Freud to write a whole lot of stuff about the human psyche. Hamlet wasn't really as popular as other plays during Shakespeare's time, but now we consider it like the grandest of his works, and that's because it is so modern. It's about like emerging selfhood and this young man whose progress into becoming a man and his own individual is thwarted. And we're like witnessing his development and trying to evolve, like develop with him, but he never quite makes it. So yeah, that was a really long ramble. But
I love it.
Yeah, that's a little bit of my stitched together thoughts on why Hamlet is considered one of, the greatest Shakespeare play today. Still not my favorite. My favorite is King Lear, just because I really connect with it emotionally. But I don't know. If I had to say what's the greatest Shakespeare play, it's Hamlet.
I just want to say hi to a couple people who came in a little late, but I'm very happy they're here. I see Sanri's joined us.
Yay! Hi, Sanri. Thanks for watching us.
Yeah, and Beth, I'm so glad you were able to make it. I hope everything went good with your doctor's appointment. So glad to have you here.
Welcome.
And
where were we? I started rambling about transcendental art, and then Freud and
we were talking about
selfhood.
we weren't talking about Branagh, where when we talked about his sort of grand operatic nature. But what I do love is that he has parts where he's gloriously over the top. But what I really love about his performance is then he will very quickly dip into doing something incredibly subtle and beautiful.
I mean, very quickly, you'll have him saying at the top of his lungs, "Thou hast killed my father, but what was it like when you dripped poison in his ear? Thou villain!" And then he'll like drop out. Again, that was not; those were not real Shakespeare lines, but that's kind of how he is.
Yeah, I think one of those key moments comes in the second half of the film, where you have the scene where he and Laertes are shouting at each other at Ophelia's grave. And Hamlet is, he's been caught off guard by the news of Ophelia's death. So he's just sort of unleashing in shock and pain. And Branagh's unleashing his full over the topness, we'll call it. But then in the next breath, he goes, "Hear me, sir. What is the reason you use me thus? I loved you ever." And it's such a, it's such polar opposites, but it's beautiful because it dovetails from one extreme to the other and makes people think that, he's even more, mad.
Yeah. And I think that's what Hamlet does too.
Yeah.
Like he is, I don't know, like I hate using psychological diagnoses, but this is literature. These aren't real people. So, I would think that Hamlet at this point would definitely fit bipolar disorder with the manic highs and the lows. And that kind of performance is actually if you were to interpret it that way, that kind of performance is really indicative of that mental state. And yeah, over the top is a good way to put it, but I love how over the top it is. And I love how this production just explores new ways of presenting this material and in ways that other productions hadn't before. Like we talked about the brightness, and not everybody liked it, like most people did. Most reviewers, most critics found it to be a really fabulous production and arguably the best Hamlet, but there were some people who really didn't like the newness of it and didn't like the glossiness of it. It's a bit too self-indulgent is what some critics said who didn't like it. But what is Hamlet if not self-indulgent? So I kind of like it for that. It's very meta in that way.
Yeah. And I do. I remember at the time that I saw it, I likened it to having the visual flair of a David Lean epic. And, in the vein of the Dr. Zhivago and stuff like that. And so I love it for that reason, because it's kind of right up my alley.
And Julie Christie was in Dr. Zhivago too. So
and I have to say I just love the entire look and feel of it. And we mentioned a little bit about Patrick Doyle's music, but for me it's one of the high points of the film because it's a very romantic score.
It's very romantic, and it fits. I like how it locks into the time period that they set it with the set and the costumes.
So. And what I kind of like is, some scores have a multitude of different themes that are interweave. Hamlet, not to say, because it has some variations on, some different types of themes, but it often comes back to Hamlet's theme, and it's played in different ways. And I particularly love the more romantic setting, especially when he's with Ophelia. It's just, again, it just highlights sort of the romance of the story, but it's tragic because, again, of the way he treats Ophelia. And it
is. There's a lot of feelings. There's a lot of thoughts. Lady Leaf Underhill just asked, why did they choose to set it in Victorian times? Before your Pride and Prejudice stream, I found out that the old movie version did so because Gone with the Wind had just come out and been super popular. That's a good question. Do you know why they chose to set it in Victorian times? I don't actually know much about the history of this film or the making of it. So
I know that. Let me see if I can remember, because Branagh talks a little bit about it in a behind the scenes in documentary that I think was actually, it wasn't a documentary. It was the film reel they did for the Cannes Film Festival. Mm-hmm. And it was about, they wanted to update it to, sort of present a fresh interpretation, but they didn't want to modernize it too much because
that trods on old territory. A lot of times I would actually say more often than not these days, you see Hamlet presented in a modern setting, and I wouldn't even say just any modern setting, but a contemporary setting where people are wearing clothes like we're wearing in the 21st century. And that's because of how modern the play feels. Like I was talking about, how ahead of its time it feels, and how it really deals so much with introspection and emerging selfhood. And like Hamlet is a character that feels at home in the modern world. But I think that Branagh chose to put it in Victorian times, maybe partly because it hadn't been set in Victorian times before. And it's also very beautiful, like the costumes. I mean, you got to admit, it's really beautiful the way that he chose to present it. But I also like to think that there's something else compelling about that time period artistically that he thought really communicated themes of fate versus free will in Hamlet. Like I was talking about with the art of that period and how it really depicted man and against the scope of nature. I mean, they thought about fate versus free will quite a lot in artistic mediums in that early half of the 19th century. So I don't know. I wonder if that's part of it, but maybe that's me thinking too hard. I'm not sure. No, it's just really pretty. I think that's mostly why.
Yeah. And I do think they were trying to strike a balance, because you mentioned that, a lot of, stuff is set in a contemporary setting, but I know Branagh did mention that he didn't want it to be so contemporary that the language felt out of place. And so
he doesn't really do ultra contemporary play or ultra contemporary adaptations.
Yeah. But
yeah,
I am glad they chose that setting, because it does make for just a beautiful interpretation. Because as we talked about before, the architecture and everything is just stunning to look at.
Yeah. And when we talk about a Victorian setting, there's like a lot of different ideas of what a Victorian is. Like I believe it spanned from the 1840s to the early 1900s. So like when we use that term, it covers a great expanse of time. And I'm not sure exactly when this adaptation was supposed to occur in that time period.
I think they were, I do believe Branagh said it wasn't set in a strict time. It was more of just I don't know the wording he used, but it's
its own setting. It's its own time setting, inspired mostly by costumes of the Victorian period.
Exactly. It would almost be thought of as like it's a fantasy sort of set in a world that resembles.
And that's kind of how it is with a lot of other Shakespeare adaptations that are in modern-ish settings, like Romeo and Juliet by Baz Luhrmann. It's mostly contemporary, but a really fabulous kind of contemporary. And if anybody's seen Titus with Anthony Hopkins, that costuming and set is inspired by ancient Rome, and also some kind of a fantasy world that it makes it look like it's set in its own time period. Like there's some stuff that looks very contemporary about it, some stuff that looks really Roman about it, and some stuff which is just fantastical in its own time period. And I think it's really hard to achieve that blend and have the right amount of historical inspiration and individual creative interpretation so that it looks like it's its own thing and not just trying to be its own thing and gimmicky. It's a fine line to walk, but
yeah,
Branagh really does it well with this one.
I did want to move on now to another cast member who probably does not get talked about as much, and his name is Nicholas Farrell, who plays Horatio.
Oh, he's so
and
good in this.
He is, one of my favorite parts of this film, just because I feel like, I don't want to say he's underappreciated, because the part of Horatio is vital to the play, but he's not one of the bigger names, at least not one of the bigger movie names. I'm sure he's probably done a lot of stage work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's very, very good. I mean, you need somebody who's really good to be Horatio. Horatio to me is kind of like Sam in Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire. He's like the rock, and you know that Horatio is going to be the one who tells the story at the end, because he's the only one living at the end. Well, by the time Fortinbras and everybody comes in, and Fortinbras literally tells him, or somebody at the end does, you're going to be the one who tells this story and tells us what happened here, because we just walked in and there are corpses strewn all over the place. And I don't know, we actually have a bit of a cheerier outlook to look forward to in A Song of Ice and Fire if it ends up like Game of Thrones. But, Sam is also like the one writing the book at the end, and they're very similar in personality, and they're the friend to the main character. And this isn't too, I mean, there's some similarities between Hamlet and Jon Snow, but that's a stream for another day.
Yeah, I mean, you could say that Horatio resembles a lot of Sam characters, because I think is Samwise from Lord of the Rings as well.
Yes, that's true.
Because he's that loyal companion who sticks by him. And actually, it was
loyal companion archetype, yeah.
It was really interesting, because this is going off on kind of a tangent, but what I loved about seeing Hamlet with Horatio is because you also see Hamlet with his schoolmates. Oh my God, why am I blanking?
Rosencrantz and Guildenstern.
Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, and he's very chummy with them, and you kind of see two different friendships that Hamlet has, fitting the different aspects of his personality. I like to imagine that he parties a lot with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern.
I like that idea.
And that with Horatio, he's kind of...
Horatio's the one who takes care of him when he's hungover and processes the big thoughts.
Exactly.
He gets tired of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern sometimes and needs to have an adult conversation with Horatio. And Horatio's the one who's like, Hamlet, shouldn't you just be growing up now? But he never says that, because he's too humble to say that.
Exactly. But I mean, what's great is, you say that Horatio is the only one left alive at the end, but he also is the one who knows the entirety of what's transpired.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Because Hamlet confides in him throughout, and really him alone. I mean, there's so many great scenes with him. I really do love, and there's a moment between the two of them towards the end, before the fencing match, where Hamlet's really talking to him about how close he feels to him, and how much of a friend he is, and and it's just so great to see so much. And that friendship is so deep that Horatio wants to follow Hamlet to the grave, and at the end. And it is Hamlet that tells him, no, you have to be the one to tell people what's actually happened.
You really get a sense that Hamlet's kind of figured out what's important in life. And he's actually, I don't know, I almost feel like he's found some peace by the end, by that duel, but it's like too little too late.
Yeah.
And, events have already set like the wheel of fate in motion, and there's just nothing to be done for it. Waited too long. But anyway,
Yeah, it is interesting because when you see Hamlet come back in the second half of the film, it does seem like it's a Hamlet who has kind of learned from some of his mistakes and is more mature. Which I wanted to ask you because you know a bit more about the play than I probably do. How much time is supposed to have passed?
That is up for debate. Like, I don't know. There are different thoughts about this from the scholars, the hashtag scholars. But I think I think I've read that even a decade might have passed. Like Hamlet, based on some of the lines that are delivered, and this is why Hamlet is often played by an actor in his 40s or later. Not exclusively why, but I mean, the real reason why is because these actors are ready for that kind of a role. Because who at 20 is ready to play Hamlet?
Yeah.
But honestly, it's not a small amount of time that has passed. It's definitely years that have passed in between when he left Denmark and when he came back. But I don't know. I actually want to Google that really quickly just to see if I'm right, because now I'm thinking that can't be right that a decade or more have passed, because he basically just got on the boat with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, discovered that they were going to betray him, and then came right back.
Yeah, because I've gone sort of back and forth, whereas I know when I watched it a couple of years ago, I thought, it had a couple of years passed, and then when I watched it last night, I was thinking, God, maybe it's only a couple months.
Yeah, you know what? I think it is only a couple months, because I'm Googling it now, and it is only a couple months, but I swear that I've read something before where...
because it does make sense, because
I think that it's more of like an aging up of himself internally, that makes it feel like so many years have passed.
Yeah, because Laertes shows up angry about the death of his father. It would be kind of weird if he only found out about it a couple of years.
No, wait, later. No. I'm looking at. You're asking about the time when he leaves Denmark and when he comes back, right?
Yeah.
So as I'm Googling this, I'm like finding references to time that's passed in between when King Hamlet was killed and the start of the play. So that's different from what we're looking up. I don't know. If anybody else has some time to look this up.
Sorry to spring that on you.
Yeah, well, no. This is like one of those things that seriously only the scholars would know this stuff. Like I'm still very much a Shakespeare amateur. I just really like it. And that's not to diminish my passion for it or my knowledge about it at all. But I don't know. This is one thing where I swear I've heard before that years have passed in between his voyage from Denmark and his return to Denmark. And there's evidence for it in the play somewhere, but it's kind of contradicted by other things that are said. You know what? We will return to this later. Okay. I'll make a tweet. I'll tweet about it. How about that?
Yeah. We're getting close to the hour mark, so I'm just going to pause for a second and go through some things about what's coming up on the stream, and then we will pick up with the second half. So next week, guys, I am going to be talking about Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, and I'm going to have my special guest for this one is going to be Hannah from the Game of Owns podcast. She's been a good friend for a couple of years, and I'm just super excited to have her on to talk about that. She, I think I told this last week, but I went to my first fan my first real fan convention with her and Zach, who co-host the show together, because I had been to Star Wars Celebration years before that, but this was like my first really fan-centric convention. It was Aditi Khan, and she took me along to the Wizard Rock concert that they had. So she is a big Harry Potter fan.
That sounds like so much fun.
So yeah, it's going to be great. And this Saturday, yeah, Stephen, I'm getting to it. This Saturday, we're going to be having a Star Wars Love Fest on the Here Be Dragons channel, which I'm a co-host on, along with the great Stephen Stark and Nessie, and we're going to have a couple of guests on with us, and it's going to be a blast because I know a couple of us are really hyped up about the series finale of Clone Wars coming up. So that is going to be a whole bunch of fun. And do you have anything you're working on, Lauren, that you want to tell people about?
I don't have anything I'm working on right now. I'm just kind of enjoying the moment, really. At some point, I would like to upload my video from the audio footage that I have from Con of Thrones, where I talked about Shakespeare villains in A Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones. So that will get uploaded to my YouTube channel eventually. And it's been a long time coming because that was last summer. So that tells you a little bit about how productive I'm being during this quarantine. But no, I usually just like to leech off of other people's channels and be a guest and fangirl over favorite movies and stuff.
Yeah, and actually I am going to try and sway you back on at a later date, because we want to talk about Master and Commander.
One of my all-time favorite movies.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I joke a lot about how obsessive I am about Lord of the Rings, but seriously, in 2003, if it wasn't for Return of the King, Master and Commander would have been the one I was rooting for best picture.
It really should have. I still I love Lord of the Rings, but I kind of hold a grudge against Return of the King because Master and Commander deserved more.
That's okay, because I hold a huge grudge against A Beautiful Mind and Chicago for beating the first two Lord of the Rings. So
you know what? If we could trade A Beautiful Mind for, which one did it beat out? Was it Fellowship?
Yeah, well, here's the thing. That movie beat out both Fellowship of the Ring and Moulin Rouge. It's no, they did not make the right choice.
Fellowship should have gotten Best Movie. And Russell Crowe was in A Beautiful Mind as well, you see. So he was in Master and Commander. So that could be the Russell Crowe movie that got Best Picture in the early 2000s.
Much better choice.
I've corrected it. I've fixed it.
Yeah. God.
All right.
And yeah, I could do an entire stream about my grievances with the Academy Awards, but...
Yeah,
but
these days anyway.
Yeah. Okay, so let's dive back into Hamlet. Let's talk about the absolutely wonderful Kate Winslet, who was
Ophelia ever.
And this was quite early in her career. And she was coming off of, I think the year before, she had done Sense and Sensibility.
Yeah, this was even before Titanic.
Yeah.
Titanic was the next year. Yeah.
It's just such a gorgeous performance. I mean,
it is.
She's
it's difficult for me to rank Hamlets, which one is the best Hamlet, even though I feel like this is the most comprehensive and textured. But as far as Ophelia's, Kate Winslet is far and away the best Ophelia. She's just, she has me the whole way. And her mad scene, a lot of those lines she delivers in a way that I've never heard them delivered before, and she's so good. I don't know, she's something like 22 at that time, and it's amazing to me that an actor, any actor you see who plays Hamlet, like I said, most of them are in their 40s because you have to be that seasoned. to even attempt. I mean, you can always make an attempt, but to really succeed, you know, you have to be about that old. David Tennant and Mel Gibson were the same. And Laurence Olivier was, I don't think he was the spring chicken either when he played Hamlet, but I'll have to Google that really quickly. But Kate Winslet was like 22. And that performance is just incredible.
Yeah, it's, you mentioned when she's, you know, gone mad, and there's so many, just because it's one thing to have the lines, you know, Shakespeare's lines, but there's so much wonderful interpretation on her part of those lines and the stuff she's doing physically in that scene.
Yeah.
It's just absolutely remarkable.
Like a lot of Ophelia performances that you'll see, she's just kind of, and this is not to diminish them because they're still like really good, and Shakespeare's language is so good that it carries it, but a lot of it is sing-songy the whole way through, like, oh, hey, nonny, no, hey, down, down, down. And she's like doing this weird, this thing with her fingers where it looks like she's playing with some thread, some imaginary thread. She doesn't even have real flowers, which, you know, is a director decision, but she plays with it so well. And she's like sort of making jokes to herself, the way that she delivers the line, like, oh, hey, nonny, 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 and a down, a down, a down. It's, I can't do it the way that she does it because it's so good, but you like believe that she's got something else going on inside her head and not that she's trying to play at being mad. It's so convincing.
What would you say is your favorite moment of hers in the film? Is it that, or
what my favorite? I still really love the moment that I talked about before the intermission.
Oh no, sorry, I meant with Ophelia.
Oh, with Ophelia.
With her performance.
Yeah, I'd have to say so. I mean, that's like the sort of quintessential Ophelia moments that it's so sad though. I mean, there's rarely an Ophelia moment which isn't sad. It's the thing. That whole scene, yeah.
Yeah, I think what really breaks my heart is the encounter with Hamlet in the main hall. Just when, you know, when she returns some of the things that he gave her, and the way he's just, you know, angry at her, and he's lashing out, and then once the scene is over and she's just on the floor and her monologue in that moment, and she's just awash in tears, is so brilliantly acted.
The mirror scene. Yeah, that's really good too. I mean, the thing is that I kind of hate saying that the Ophelia mad scene is my favorite Ophelia scene because it's so depressing, and it's when she's lost herself. But the other thing, the thing that's only more depressing is that that's like the one true scene that she has for herself, where all the attention is on her. Like in every other Ophelia scene, she's just kind of, you know, a side character to somebody else's stage. You know, it's Hamlet who's the main focus, but she is the main focus in that mad scene. And it's so sad that it's because she's gone mad and nobody cared about her before then, or cared in the way that they should have, you know?
Yes.
Like, you like, even with the scene where Laertes is giving her all this advice and saying, you know, don't put all your eggs in Hamlet's basket because you've got to stay virtuous, and blah,
I
blah,
do
blah. You know,
like
it's like men telling her what to do, and then finally in that one scene that she has where she's going mad, like that's all for her.
I do like, though, in that scene with Laertes where she turns it back on him and says, follow your own advice.
Yeah, I know.
That is really a great moment.
Mm-hmm. It is. And then following on that scene immediately is Polonius giving Laertes his fatherly advice, which, you know, is funny because Polonius doesn't always follow his own advice.
Yeah, the portrayal of Polonius in this is really good too, because it's a bit more fleshed out than normal. I know he's normally played a bit buffoonish, and he does still have his moments of that in this, but but it is a more fully rounded portrayal.
Yeah, and I enjoy that fully roundedness too, because otherwise it's hard to be completely not sympathetic, but to be with Ophelia and her feelings when she's so distraught when he's dead. You know, like if Polonius is just played as a buffoon throughout Hamlet, then when he dies, it's like, well, who cares? You know, but Ophelia really cares. So I'm glad that he wasn't like played as a total fool.
It is still, though, so much fun watching Hamlet just toy with him.
It is.
Just and you know, I mean, I could just go on about the parts, you know, of this movie that I love, but I do really love just when Polonius says, "Sir, I will take my leave of you," and the Hamlet's like, "You cannot take from me, sir, anything that I would more willingly part with."
I know.
He goes, "Except my life. Except my life."
Except my life. Yeah. Oh, man, he plays it so well.
Yeah. And should we? I guess we should talk, because we're talking about the cast, and it really can't go without mentioning that this movie has a lot of, I wouldn't call it stunt casting, but there's a lot of famous faces.
It is star-studded. I mean, it is the definition of a star-studded cast. Even very small roles that don't even have their own names have huge actors in them.
And when we talked about this before we started, but the studio did tell Branagh, you know, we're with you on this project. It's a very good idea. We appreciate your vision for it. But if you're going to put out a 4-hour Hamlet, you need a tip-top cast.
I love that.
So,
and Branagh was like, no problem. I got friends in high places.
So we have, just to start with the bigger ones, I'll just read through the list here. We have Robin Williams as Osric.
Yeah. Which is like, who remembers who Osric is?
Gerard Depardieu as Ronaldo. Timothy Spall as Rosencrantz.
Yes.
I don't know his counterpart quite as well, but Reeston Stale as Guildenstern. Jack Lemmon as Marcellus. And this is a treat, which I would not have even known this, but God, and I'm not going to be able to pronounce his name because I've never had to before, but Ian McKinney as Bernardo, that is our beloved Sir Barristan from Game of Thrones.
What? Wait, how did I not recognize Sir Barristan?
Because he doesn't look like himself.
Wait.
He plays Bernardo, one of the sentries. He's in the opening scene. It's him, Marcellus, and Horatio who see the ghost.
Wait a minute.
He's got darker hair, and he's got, like, you know, hair around his face, and he looks different. But once I found out it was him, I was able to spot it.
Oh, man.
I just thought that was
I'm gonna have to scroll back to the beginning and check that out then, because I did not catch that. And I am usually pretty good at spotting my Game of Thrones actors. But
and then we have Brian Blessed as Hamlet's father, which is just great. I love Brian Blessed. He's such a fantastic actor. And maybe my favorite of the of the cameos, Billy Crystal as the first gravedigger. He's so good.
Billy Crystal was great.
And you wouldn't think he would fit in.
Oh, he did.
but he did. He totally does.
Yeah. I mean, that gravedigger scene is like the comic relief anyway, so.
Yeah, I mean, just his banter back and forth with Branagh, and the way they play it, what's interesting, that's another thing I love about this film, and especially the way Branagh plays Hamlet and the way a lot of the other actors are. There's such a the way they perform the lines is that you get their meaning even if you're not that proficient in Shakespeare's language, and the way they react to lines, it's and especially that scene between Billy Crystal and Kenneth Branagh is great because they're going back and forth, and
Branagh, "'Tis not thy grave, thou liest in it." Though thou liest in it.
And then there's an exchange about upon what ground, and Billy Crystal says in Denmark, and the way Branagh just responds with like, ugh. So,
I know.
That's great.
Like, oh God, stop with the dad jokes already.
And then you also have not Kenneth Branagh, Charlton Heston as the player.
Yeah, there are a lot of cameos in that player scene.
Yeah, and you just want to slap Polonius because he's talking crap about Heston's performance, and it's like, it's so good, and you're like,
it's hilarious.
The guy's got no taste whatsoever.
Yeah, and what I love about that scene with the players, another thing that we haven't touched on in our review of this movie so far is how many flashbacks there are. Like, I mean, it's interesting because sometimes in the movie there will be a really long single shot, which feels very stage-like, like you don't want to cut up the to be or not to be speech with different shots. You want that to be all in one take because it's like the most famous monologue ever. But then throughout the movie, you also have like a lot of visual montages as somebody else is speaking, and like flashbacks, like while the players are talking about the works that they've done, there's like some flashback to
it's Priam and
Priam and Hecuba, who's played by Judi Dench. And what I love about it is that all these actors who are in that player scene, they're very like old Shakespearean actors too, and it's like paying homage to that previous generation of Shakespearean actors. So
what's crazy is Judi Dench doesn't even have a line in the flashback.
I know.
She's just there.
I mean, she was totally willing to do it too. She was like, hell yeah. She probably thought it was hilarious that she didn't have a line.
Because she was in Branagh's Henry V. I know that. And she did have, actual lines in that. But yeah, I do just love the fact that she's giving essentially a performance with her expressions and her face, and it's just a couple seconds long, and then that's it. And someone else you have in that flashback is John Gielgud playing King Priam, and he's just a legendary actor.
Yeah.
It was great to see him. I mean, that was kind of what was really great about with Charlton Heston too. It's like this movie doesn't feel that long ago to me. I mean, it was like 24 years ago?
It's crazy,
which is insane. But to me, it doesn't.
Like
it doesn't feel that long. But you have this prior generation of phenomenal actors that appear in this movie, and it's so wonderful to see. But yeah, it is really depressing that
I mean, now Branagh is entering the like prior generation of Shakespearean actors. Like kind of the new wave is the Tom Hiddlestons and oh crap, who else has been doing a lot? Actually, you know what? I just don't think Tom Hiddleston is the only one that comes to mind who's on Branagh's level and who does a lot of Shakespeare. But yeah, Branagh's getting older now too. And it's amazing how long ago this movie was, 24 years. Holy crap. I mean, I saw this tweet or meme a while ago where it was saying, yeah, the 90s were 20 years ago, which is really funny because the 80s were also 20 years ago, or the year 2000 was 20 years ago now, but it's like the 80s was 20 years ago too. And that's how I always think of it in my mind. Yeah, getting old.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like maybe it's just me, but part of growing up at the time when we had the changeover to the year 2000, part of the result of that is I always count backwards from 2000.
Yeah, it's like the whole change of century thing.
Yeah.
Like I feel like if we had been born in the 60s and we're, just entering the 2000s, the counting, the math wouldn't be so weird. But yeah, it's being in the year 2020. It's also the internet, which exploded around that same time. It's the cultural shifts that we've had, which are constant anyway. But I don't know. I wonder what Shakespeare would say about it.
Yeah. So the Hamlet stream, also known as the Loren and I complain about getting older stream.
Yes, the nostalgia about old times, which there's a lot of nostalgia in Hamlet too. There's a lot of references to memory and remembrance. There's Rosemary, that's for remembrance, and then Hamlet's ghost telling him to remember him, and which is funny because it's also a very future-oriented play too, like what actions will result of these thoughts and these moral quandaries. So yeah,
I do want to skip back a little bit because we did breathe through some of these names. What do you think of Robin Williams as Osric? Because he puts a very particular spin on the character.
At first I was watching it and I forgot that Robin Williams was in the movie, and then I saw he was in the movie, and for some reason I instantly thought, oh, well, he must be a gravedigger. Like, that's the only role that I could cast Robin Williams in my mind. And then we got to the gravedigger scene, and it was Billy Crystal as the first gravedigger. And I was like, oh, so Robin Williams must be the second. And I peered at him, and I was like, no, that's not him. And I was like, well, where does he show up? Was I wrong? Is he in this movie? And then he shows up at the end to be Osric, who, is... setting up this duel for Laertes and Hamlet at the behest of Claudiuss, and he is kind of buffoonish, a little bit silly, but I still feel like this role is not worthy of Robin Williams in a way. Like I love Robin Williams in anything, but I felt like I wanted more for Robin Williams.
Well, it's like I just kept thinking about the fact that this movie was done in the same year as The Birdcage, and I'm just wondering if there if there was some, melding of the two roles, because he certainly does seem to think very fondly of Laertes.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's he's fun, but yeah, you almost wish he had a better role for himself.
Mm-hmm.
But,
yeah, it was good though. I mean, I love seeing all the cameos. So
yeah. And let's see, who else was I? And Jack Lemmon as Marcellus. It's a small role. I know I've heard that some people are kind of think that he didn't necessarily do as good of a job as some of the other actors, but I think that's a little unfair. I think he did quite a good job.
Well, I think that maybe it was just expected that he would be funny.
Okay.
And it's not really a comical role.
Yeah.
I mean, it's almost kind of like my deal with the Robin Williams cameo, or I don't know if you could call it a cameo. It's a little bit bigger than a cameo, maybe. And there were so many cameos that at a certain point you stop calling them cameos. But yeah, it was just kind of like, oh, this is not what I expected for this actor in this role. But I liked it all the same.
Yeah, the thing about Robin Williams, I do kind of like the back and forth with, with the hat and everything. And Hamlet keeps messing with him, and he keeps putting it back on and off. So, there's some good comedy to play with. But and then we mentioned this a little bit, I think, before we started, but it is sort of great that Richard Attenborough steps in at the last minute as the English ambassador, because it always feels to me like all this dramatic stuff has happened at the end of the play, but it's like, no, we have this one more surprise for you.
Yeah.
And he walks in the room and he's got like 2 lines and just acts the hell out of it.
It's almost like that challenge to Branagh to fill the cast with stars was accepted in the most enthusiastic way possible, and it's almost like he's throwing it in the faces of anybody who doubted that he could make a successful 4-hour movie.
That's great because, and it's the same thing with what we said about Judi Dench coming in for, a role with no lines, but just seeing someone of Richard Attenborough's character, quality, just come in for this very small part at the end of the play, it just speaks to what's being brought to this adaptation, that everything is just like, A+ effort, and all throughout, and that these actors would be willing to come on for even the smallest parts. And it's just great. I love it.
Yeah, there's so much enthusiasm in the cast in general. Like, you just really get a sense that everybody's excited to do this movie. Like you said, that everybody looks like they're having a good time, and that's because they are.
Yeah, and again, this was probably the first time that I really loved Shakespeare, was this film. And it is, again, because there seems to be such joy in it. And, just the performances, and again, I'm repeating myself, but everybody just seems to be having a ball doing the film. And it's just great to see that in Shakespeare, because I think it keeps it fresh.
Yeah, it does. Oh, and another big actor who's in it is Rufus Sewell, who plays Fortinbras, who we see a lot more of in this production than we normally see of Fortinbras. And I really like that, because he's not just the guy who shows up at the end to be like, oh, well, what happened here? Now I'm here to save the day. And Horatio, you tell us this story later. But it's like this this force that's coming, that is going to be there at the end of the play. Like, they refer to him a lot, or several times throughout the play, to remind us that Fortinbras is in it. But we just, in the stage version, we wouldn't get to see him. So I like that the movie does all these images of him and all these flashbacks to what's happening with him, because it's really important, because Fortinbras is both a parallel for Hamlet and a foil for him, because he, while Hamlet is the type of prince who procrastinates and delays too long on what he means to do and thinks too much, Fortinbras is the one who's taking action. Like Hamlet, his father died, and his father was also named Fortinbras. Hamlet's father was named Hamlet. So they're similar in that way, but Fortinbras is just a different personality. And he is more driven and ambitious than Hamlet is. And that's eventually going to win out over the overthinking and wallowing in self-pity.
Now, because there is a lot of sort of cinematic and visual interpretation of events at the end of the film, which seems to me would not come across the same way in the play, because Fortinbras appears to be attacking Elsinore at the end of the film. Is that the case in the play? Is that how that plays out?
I don't remember. See, at first he's saying that he's not going to, he has no plans to conquer Denmark or anything. He just wants to pass through so that he can get to Poland. And at one point he's like asking for, permission from King Claudius so that he can do that. Or so we're told. We don't see him doing that. We just hear that that's what's happening. But I think that he learns of something's rotten in the state of Denmark. Probably word gets out, and his plans change as a result of that. That's what I recall. Maybe there was some other motive, but
I did have my interpretation, and this isn't really supported by what we see on screen or in the text, but it does seem that he's dissuaded by, is it his uncle or his
Fortinbras?
Yeah. It's his uncle or his
advisor
grandfather
told him to take Elsinore.
To back off.
Oh, to back off.
There's that whole thing in the beginning where they're sending a letter to, it's either his uncle or his grandfather to dissuade him from making designs on Denmark. And
yeah, that sounds familiar. I think that there was like some tension,
and so
in
my
that
thought was,
story.
And so my thought was, by the end of the play, if perhaps that character had passed away or something, then perhaps Fortinbras then feels like, okay, I can move in now.
Yeah, and he claims his independence from others advising him what to do, whereas Hamlet can't quite do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's interpretation, because it's not specifically stated within the play, but I do love just the whole scale of the end of the film. Because it does feel very big and epic.
It's huge and epic. Like, I love how they have this long red carpet that they're dueling on, Hamlet and Laertes, and they stick to that carpet for a time. And I even said to myself, is this the only place where they can fences back and forth on this long, skinny carpet? But oh no, I forgot that because it had been like 20 years since I'd seen this film. I forgot that they go up the stairs and, chandeliers start swinging, and they totally break the boundaries of what one would think is our stage of play.
Yes, everybody, there is actually a swinging chandelier.
Oh, yes. Worth it.
But yeah, actually, before we go on, and because I do want to focus in on the ending of the film, but let's talk for a second about the character of Laertes, which, again, what's interesting about watching the film, the actor is Michael Maloney, and what's interesting is, again, talking about those sort of opposing ranges of, same thing with Branagh, where he goes over the top in some moments and then, subtle in others. If you watch Laertes, when he appears in the beginning of the play, it's a very sort of warm presence that he gives, and his acting is understated. And then when he returns and he's enraged about his father,
he gets mad.
He gets mad, and the actor just brings he's going all in.
And what's great is that there's actually a three-way parallel and foil thing going on between Hamlet and Laertes and Fortinbras. Like, the lesson with Fortinbras coming in to, be the eventual victor in this whole mess is not that, passion wins out in the end and decisiveness wins out, because Laertes is actually the lesson in what happens when you're too impetuous and too impatient and reckless. And he just could Lorne. So like he and Hamlet are at the opposite ends of the spectrum. Hamlet is not hasty enough, and Laertes is too hasty with what he decides to do, and he's too emotionally reactive, and that spells his end, just like Hamlet's end is his delayed action.
It's interesting that Hamlet does everything he can to have a measured and careful response to what he's been told by the ghost, to the point where he even questions whether he can rely on this information to act on. Laertes comes in and he automatically puts his faith and trust in Claudiuss and goes right for revenge. So it's interesting to look at the way that the characters go about it, and neither one is really the correct course.
No, Court and Brass is the compromise between the two.
Yeah.
And it's really cool to think about thematic stuff like that and parallels between characters. Oh, so good. Shakespeare. It's no wonder he's lasted for so long. But, then again, it's like, well, what could Hamlet have done? I mean, it's funny because it's hard for me, like I said before, it's hard for me to like Hamlet that much, mostly because he's so awful to Ophelia. But as for everything else, it's hard for me to say that I would do any different. I mean, who of us has never found themselves in Hamlet's shoes, where your father has been slain by your uncle who's married your mother? But it's kind of a weird place to put yourself in and imagine, what would I do? But I mean, that's what makes his hesitance believable anyway, because it's like, who can imagine that? Like, how do you process that? How do you plan revenge? And I feel like if this were a Greek play, Hamlet would have been more Laertes-like. He would have, absolutely killed Claudiuss right away, and then it would have been more gods focused. It would have been about what the gods decide is going to happen to Hamlet's legacy and Denmark and things, and there would be a chorus telling us what we need to know and all of that. But Shakespeare is not a Greek tragedy. It's going to be more introspective and weighing moral ambiguities, and not because of what some god might do to us in the afterlife, but for what we can withstand in this life.
Yeah.
Although he does, mention, I would kill myself were it not for that undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns. So there's definitely threat of and fear of what's to come after death. I'm not saying that there isn't, but it's more of a mortal fear than a more mortal desire to please the immortal, and that's kind of where it's different to me.
Yeah, well, I mean, God, I love that scene. It's just such a beautiful monologue, and the way it's played. And it's funny because when I first started thinking about doing this stream, I watched that scene back, and I put the closed captions on, because I think it's easy when you're listening to Shakespeare, if you're not, if you're not proficient in it, and I certainly am not.
You're doing great.
you hear the lines and you can get the gist of it, but you don't always catch everything. But I remember I watched that scene with the captions on and fully grasping the full meaning of that monologue, and and there's a reason why it's a classic one. Mm-hmm. It's just so great.
Yeah, it really is. And I read like some critiques of it where they thought that it was like a little bit too actorly, a little bit too rehearsed. But I genuinely think that that's because Branagh is playing it like Hamlet knows that he's being watched, which is so meta because he is. And in a way, he's like an observer of himself as well. whether or not he knows that Claudiuss and Polonius are there behind the door watching him behind that specific door. He's also an observer in his own mind. And there are just like so many different levels to interpretation of how he chooses to deliver that monologue.
And it's like, how do you start off with the saying to be or not to be without like feeling the weight of that and, you know, playing. And so I almost like that it starts off with almost an actorly like delivery, because that monologue is so famous that, you know, how can you not, you know, put that weight on it? So, and I do love that. And
he knows that he's being watched, or he feels that he's being watched, but at the same time, he's also looking right at himself in the mirror and speaking these words to himself. So it's just, it's such a good director choice.
And even later on, when you have Ophelia, when she's, you know, gone mad and she's sitting by the mirror talking to Laertes, you know, you can interpret that as you have characters, you know, especially Ophelia, who have been split in half, essentially. You know, her mind is fractured at that moment. And so you've got her sitting up against the mirror as really a visual representation of that. And it's just, you know, it's beautiful. It was, I really like that choice by Branagh. I think it was great. And I did also want to talk about, just because I wanted to talk about the scene, but we can talk about, hold on. Just let me look something up real quick, because
while you're looking, I have another thing that I wanted to say.
Yeah, go ahead.
So like after the to be or not to be speech, I mean, the to be or not to be speech is like the most well-known monologue in Hamlet and Shakespeare. But if you were to think of the visual for which the visual that comes to mind when you think of Shakespeare or a scene from Shakespeare, usually it's Hamlet holding up the skull of Yorick and saying, "Alas, poor Yorick," you know, and that's for like, you know, man confronting his immortality, of course. But it's like a very famous monologue, and I was always like, each time like one of these famous scenes came up, I'm like eager to see how it plays out, and he played that one like pretty straight. Like I would say the most unique thing about the Alas, Poor Yorick monologue is that they do a flashback to when Yorick the jester was alive and when Hamlet was a boy and, you know, joking around with him. And I found that very heartwarming, actually. So I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, as much as, I mean, I love Branagh's big moments, but I really do think that I love his more quiet, introspective moments even more, and that is one of them. The other one is, and probably my favorite moment of his, is towards the end of the film. I mean, I don't know which exact like scene you would reference it as, but it's the monologue he gives to Horatio right before the duel.
Where he says that he's his, you know, truest friend, something like that.
It's shortly after that. You see, I would love to be able to pull up the line, but it's just, you know, one of those. Again, it's understated, and I think that Branagh is, you know, which again is not to say I don't love his, because, you know, I love the intermission moment. I told you about that, so I love when he goes all out. And
we love Branagh in all his colors.
Yeah, I was trying to. I've got a page open of quotes. I was trying to pull it up, but it's not there. But anyway, I mean, regardless, it's a scene where it's a monologue where you feel the weight of he recognizes that something might be about to happen, something fateful, but he doesn't quite know, but he's prepared for it.
Yes.
And it's just, it's
Like
so
he's
beautiful.
already accepted his death and he's
Yeah.
ready for it. He's been like struggling with death, the idea of it throughout the play, and then he's finally accepted and made peace with it.
Yeah.
I know that moment. You're right. It's heavy.
And but the other scene I wanted to talk about is between Hamlet and Gertrude after he's stabbed Polonius.
Mm-hmm.
And just when he's, I don't like the fact that he's, raging at her, because again, it's, Hamlet's,
Yeah, women are not treated well in this play.
But
they're like scapegoated unnecessarily.
Yeah, but it's when, he's being his most, damning of her, and she's screaming out to him, saying no more of these words, and then the ghost of his father appears again. And what I love about this is, well, first of all, the performances, because the way Branagh just sort of backs up and he's shaken to the court to see him. But what I love is the interpretation of this, because his father is appearing much differently to him in this scene than in the prior one. And I feel like that's Hamlet's father recognizing that maybe he took the wrong approach.
Yeah. Yes.
And he's trying to, a softer hand at this point, trying to refocus Hamlet and so that he sets his mind on what he should be doing. And just, as frightening as his father is in the earlier scene, Brian Blessed just plays, you get the sense of the nurturing father that he probably was. And again, it's the way the music comes in when Gertrude says, on what do you look? And Hamlet points and says, on him. And the theme comes in, and it's soft and it's beautiful, and you get the love that Hamlet had for his father and his desperation at this point in the story, and it's so beautiful. I just love it.
It's funny because every time the ghost shows up during that scene, I forget that it happens. I always think of the ghost as just Hamlet's ghost as something that happens at the beginning of the play, and every time that scene with Gertrude rolls around, and I always think, oh, this is where he stabs Polonius and yells at Gertrude. But there's also the ghost who shows up and says, remember me. And you're right. In other productions, it's done in a way where it feels like the ghost is telling Hamlet, now, don't back down now. Don't turn into a coward now. Remember, you have to avenge me. But in this production, it does feel like he's redirecting him in a way, because Hamlet, I didn't mean to say before that Hamlet is an entirely passive character. He's actually very reckless and impetuous when it's the exact wrong time to be stabbing Polonius dead, case in point. And I think that King Hamlet's ghost showing up to tell him to remember him is the way that was done in this movie. Yeah, I totally interpret that as him trying to gently redirect him. What I also find interesting about this scene in comparison to the ways that it's played out in other productions is you don't quite have the Oedipal complex thing going on with
that's a weird touch on the Mel Gibson version. Yeah. I'm not crazy about that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and the thing is that I'm not sure. It would be really interesting to see this production back in Shakespeare's time to see what he would have done with it, because there for sure is innuendo. But I don't know how much of it is just us taking all that we know about Freud's ideas, and Freud's ideas were largely shaped the psychosexual stuff with the son lusting after the mother anyway. That was shaped like by his interpretation of Hamlet. So it's kind of nice to have like a production that doesn't go into that whole psychosexual thing, because there's a lot else that's going on without that. I mean, it's a fine interpretation and everything. It's just a little bit overdone.
I'll just never forget, because the first time I saw the Mel Gibson version was in school.
Me too.
I just will never forget the reaction of the class when when that kiss happens, and it's like everybody's like, "Oh."
It was funny is that in oh gosh, I forgot which scene it happens in, but when Hamlet is talking to Claudiuss in one of those scenes, he's mocking him or something. He like quickly gives him a peck on the lips. You remember that? And
no.
And it took me by surprise.
Wait. No,
I was like,
in this one,
in this one.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, that's funny to see, because usually it's like Hamlet kissing his mom.
Yeah, because it's like, farewell, mother, thy loving father. Mother and father are one flesh. So I say goodbye, mother.
But yeah, I mean, that's an element that I wasn't entirely disappointed wasn't in this movie. Valid as it is as an interpretation. We don't always need Freud in our Shakespeare.
Yeah, let me see real quick, because before we move into the last section, I want to make sure that there weren't other elements that I wanted to talk about. Yeah, I mean, I'll just say some quick words about the cinematography, because we did talk about the art direction, costume design and stuff. But what's really so great about this movie is it was shot in 65 millimeter film. And I think it was the last movie to do that until Paul Thomas Anderson's The Master. So it held that distinction for quite a long time.
Yeah, so I know like very little about filmmaking itself. Like when did stuff stop being shot in like quote unquote film, and when did it go digital?
Oh yeah, well, I mean, film is one thing, and this was shot in 65 millimeter, which is
okay, and it's normally in
normally the typical format that they shoot in film is 35 millimeter.
Okay, yeah, all right, that's like
so 65 millimeter just has a lot more detail.
Yeah,
it's equivalent to like IMAX,
right?
Basically, although not necessarily the same camera.
So maybe that's why it was able to capture so much color.
Yeah, it's the detail, and actually, the film is probably due for a remaster to capture all that detail, because I think the version that's out right now in HD was done for the DVD release in 2007, and obviously there have been lots of improvements since then.
Sure.
So when it eventually gets a new 4K remaster, it's going to look astounding. But as far as the move from film to digital, that started becoming more of a thing in like the late 2000s. And now it's, so much is shot digitally. It's a rarity now for films to be shot on traditional film. Tarantino still does it. Christopher Nolan does it, but it's a rarity. But oh wait, sorry. Just wanted to say thank you, Beth.
We tried to be comfortable.
But yeah, but 65 millimeter is a very special format that, like, the old epics were shot on. Lawrence of Arabia was shot in 65 millimeter. The things of that nature. So it was a big deal when Branagh said, not only do I want to make this 4-hour epic, I want to shoot it in 65 and have it be a huge cinematic event.
Yeah, so, I mean, why, if it captures so much detail, why didn't everybody do that? Was it just harder or something?
It's more expensive.
Okay. Man, I wonder if he like put a lot of his own money into it. This is definitely his baby. I mean, if you're going to be Hamlet on the big screen, you put everything you have into it.
Yeah. I mean, it's extraordinary. I mean, this is definitely my favorite of the Branagh Shakespeare films I've seen, but I suspect, do you like Much Ado About Nothing?
Oh, I love Much Ado. I would have to say that that's my favorite, just because I have had such a long connection to it, and also Emma Thompson is just so golden and lovely in it, and captures the spirit of Beatrice so well that I can never ever imagine any other Beatrice, or really any other Benedict, or any other pairing for that matter.
But you still have to see the Joss Whedon version.
I do. You know, I've seen the trailer for it, and I'm like, oh, I don't know. It looks kind of precious for my taste, but
it's really good though.
I'll try it.
I have to ask, did you ever watch the Joss's show Angel, which was the
No, I didn't.
Okay, well then it might not have as much meaning, because I will say that for fans of that show, there were two characters who had a very tragic love story, who were played by the actors Alexis Denisof and Amy Acker.
Mm-hmm.
And they're the two actors who play Beatrice and Benedict in Much Ado About Nothing. And so the fact that they ended so tragically on Angel, and then get there happily ever after in Much Ado About Nothing. So for Joss Whedon fans, you know, it's got that extra special quality to it, because we love seeing it. It's almost like it's the version of their love story in like an afterlife type of thing.
I get it.
And especially the fact that it's in black and white, so it kind of, you know, sells that idea. So there's a whole nother level for us fans. But
okay, I'll try it. But I'm pretty sure Branagh and Thompson's Much Ado is still it's the Much Ado of my heart.
Can't argue with that.
Yeah, and also Branagh's Othello was great. I actually don't know if he directed that, but he was Iago in it, and that was incredible. I saw, you know, I have to say, Branagh can do wrong. I saw his As You Like It that he directed, and I was not a fan.
Yeah, I saw that you said that. I haven't seen it myself, probably because it got mixed reviews.
Yeah, it's a bit overwrought, and he tries to, like, I don't know. He like does this weird setting in I forgot when it's set, but it like part of it is in Japan, or I don't know. They're just like a lot of white people wearing kimonos, and I'm like, what's going on here? It seems like a little bit of you know, trying to have really beautiful costumes and an interesting cultural setting without really having a need or explanation for it. And I don't know. As You Like It is one of those plays that I find the lines are beautiful, and there's some really gorgeous monologues and stuff, but in general, it's a little bit boring to me.
Yeah, I know there are a couple more that I want to check out. I'm trying to think of the Shakespeare films that I've actually seen, because I have seen the original Much Ado with Branagh and Emma Thompson, which I did very much enjoy. And then
Henry V is his other really big one. Yes, I feel like, aside from Hamlet, and that's really good.
Yeah, that's another one. They did a Blu-ray release a couple of years ago, and I did pick that up. I'm very happy to have that. I don't love it quite as much as Hamlet, but
I'll tell you what, I'm looking forward to. I still think he has a few more years to go, but eventually, every great Shakespearean actor plays King Lear. That's kind of like the crowning role in a long career of acting in Shakespeare, and I'm really excited to see Branagh do that. He's not quite old enough yet, I don't think. He's still probably in his 60s or something. He'll need to get to his 70s or 80s. Like Anthony Hopkins just did it a couple years ago, and he's in his 80s now. So I'm really looking forward to that one because King Lear is my favorite.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much, I do generally love anything that Branagh acts in, too, just beyond Shakespeare. He's probably one of my favorite actors to do the Harry Potter films.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
I do
God.
think that he was
Professor
just
Lockhart. So
fantastic
good.
as that.
Yeah. Yeah. Perfectly cast role. That and Snape, Rickman as Snape, were two roles that were perfectly cast in. I mean, there were many great matches for actors to characters in Harry Potter, but yeah, Gilderoy Lockhart, Kenneth Branagh was a good choice. Okay, so we have a question.
Yeah. What do you think of The Lion King as an interpretation?
It's definitely an interpretation. I mean, yeah, it's totally valid. That was a conscious decision to have Hamlet vibes in The Lion King, and not just vibes, but a basic structure where you have the evil uncle killing the king, and then the prince, having to avenge his father. Of course, I don't know. It's definitely Disneyfied in many ways. Scar is more of an evil uncle than Claudiuss is, and I think that Simba has fewer problems than Hamlet. It's like figuring out what to do, and we don't really have an Ophelia character. I mean, we have a love interest, but Ophelia is not really in the movie. There's the basic structure, and it is a kind of a revenge story. And finding of self story, I guess you would say. I mean, did Disney really make a revenge movie? I don't think it's really supposed to be that. Like Titus Andronicus is a revenge play, and that is very bloody. You can't Disneyfy that. Although that would be fun. But yeah, Lion King is definitely a twist on Hamlet. It's cool.
Although they certainly left out any hints of Oedipal stuff.
Oh, yeah. That would have been weird.
But
my favorite Disney from that era was Aladdin, though. I think that was the one I watched the most. But
and see, me being the hopeless romantic that I am, I love Beauty and the Beast.
Oh, Beauty and the Beast was good too. They're all good, like Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Lion King.
I feel so lucky that I got to grow up during the Disney Renaissance.
Yeah, I know.
Was just so great.
Yeah.
But I did want to just talk a little bit more before we wrap up about the ending of the film, which is just again, we talked about the scale of it. I do love that, but again, it's kind of another Branagh-esque moment where he kind of builds up to the grand finale moment. He has Horatio give his speech to Fortinbras, and I do love the way that Rufus Sewell comes in and sits down and then has the crown put on his head.
Mm-hmm.
You feel the gravity of this changing of the times, the fall of a dynasty and the rise of a new one, and the way the music builds up. And then again, like I said, Branagh actually has himself like carried off in the most dramatic fashion possible.
Yeah, it is. And it's funny because Hamlet is a tragedy, but it feels a bit like history in this way, because the Henriade cycle ends with Richard III being killed by Richmond on Bosworth Field, who becomes Henry VII. But the thing is that you don't really hear about Richmond that much throughout the rest of Richard III. It's just about Richard III as evil psychopath who's trying to attain the throne and get his vengeance for being what he perceives as maligned by his family. And it's very much focused on Richard III, and Hamlet is, not a villain like Richard III, although some have argued that Hamlet he has villainous elements. I don't think he's a villain, though. He's definitely our protagonist, but he's like the central focus of the play, and somebody is crowned at the end who we don't even see until the very end. So it's interesting in that way, but we're given like that sense of peace, that everything is sort of going to resume and return to normal, and like we don't have to worry about all this strife continuing that we've just witnessed in the play. Whereas, I don't know, in other tragedies, it does feel more like doom and gloom is going to not continue, but like it doesn't feel all settled. I still feel sad at the end of Hamlet, but it feels a little bit victorious with Fortinbras coming in. And
I really do love the idea that you have, we get to see him earlier but I love the idea that, once again, it's these great actors coming in who don't have huge roles, but knocked it out of the park. I love having Rufus Sewell come in at the end, and he has such a weight of authority about him, and sort of regal grandeur.
He does. He's a good choice for that role.
And he gets to utter the final words, which are "Go, bid the soldiers shoot," and it's such a great dramatic moment. And and then the music takes over, and Patrick Doyle brings in the chorus at that point, and so it gets really operatic, and so once again it's like Branagh's not going to be subtle for the big ending of it, which is part of it.
And isn't he like laid to rest in a coffin and all of that? Don't we show him like going in the ground or something?
With holding a sword as he's laying there.
And there's a part where he's being carried out of the throne room, and he's looking kind of like Christ-like, upside down with his hands out over the shoulders of I don't know, these guys who are bearing the weight of him, and his eyes are open, he's looking right at the camera. Oh, so dramatic.
Wait, and speaking of which, and there's and because I forgot to mention this earlier, I do also love, after Polonius's death, after he stabs Polonius, the way he has Polonius's eyes like darting off to the side, almost looking at Hamlet accusingly.
Oh yeah,
it's brilliant.
Yeah, there's detail that this was all about, the detail of this production, and I appreciate that so much. As an audience member, but as one who's watching it again and picking up on things that I definitely didn't see when I was, what was the first time I watched it? I think I was 12 or something.
Oh, wow.
I mean, I was barely a human. So.
But speaking of, way back when, I do remember like seeing this movie sitting on the shelf of like a video store, back in the days of VHS. And it just seeing the cast list, and I remember thinking as a kid, like, if they poured all that money into the cast, it probably isn't very good. Like,
it probably isn't very good.
because that's probably what the attraction is. And so I would realize my mistake years later. And speaking of,
I mean, the thing is that along with the other elements of production, it's another one of those things that's over the top, is this cast. And I mean, you got a point if you say it is over the top. Some have critiqued this movie and said that it's overwrought, but like I said before, there are elements about this play itself and Hamlet's mental processing that are overwrought. So I think that it works really well from a meta point of view.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And I was only going to mention that when I actually saw this film for the first time, it was actually, speaking of the VHS tape, it was on VHS, and I feel like, so terrible about that, because it was like, a pan and scan VHS version, and this is such a beautiful film, the way it's shot. I remember seeing, I think there was an ad for either the soundtrack or something or other at the opening of the movie, and it showed the film in its full widescreen ratio, and I'm like, why can't I see it like that? And so I was really psyched when the DVD came out. That was a big thing. But yeah,
beautiful movie.
Was there anything else you wanted to touch on? I think
there's always more stuff to talk about with this movie. We could probably watch it again and do this stream again with a completely new 2 hours of perspective. But I think that we hit on the stuff that we wanted to pretty well.
Okay. Hey guys in the chat, do you have any questions? I see you guys have been talking about
Disney movies.
About Disney movies, which I can't blame you.
Yeah.
Beth. we're on the same level right there.
Yeah, that would be your type, John. It seems like.
Oh wow. I am getting called out. No, I will wrap up because I thought about doing this to put a cap on these streams, because why not? What are your 5 favorite movies?
My 5 favorite movies of all time?
Yeah.
Okay, Amadeus. It's just been my favorite movie since I was like a kid. Just love it. Watched it the other night, actually, in this full director's cut version, and it still holds up. It's so good. Master and Commander. And sometimes Master and Commander is my favorite, sometimes Amadeus, but they're kind of both in the top slot there. Wizard of Oz, another favorite since childhood. Just love it. And let's see. I probably have seen no movie more times that I've seen Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. I watch it every Thanksgiving with my family, with Steve Martin and John Candy. And it's so funny. Definitely my favorite holiday movie, and a movie that I quote a lot in general. Oh, and then a 5th movie. I really love this indie movie called Another Earth, which I feel like is very underrated. It's probably the most underrated movie on my list.
I think I've heard of it. I haven't seen it though.
Yeah, it's really good. It's kind of a sci-fi fantasy movie, but it's not like the type that you think. It's like when you think of fantasy, you think of sci-fi fantasy, you think of like being in outer space and having, Star Wars or something like that. But this takes place on Earth, and it's about the discovery of another Earth, which is coming towards us in space. And it's from the point of view of this girl who's gone to college, and she makes a big mistake. And I won't say what that is because I don't want to spoil it, but it's like a very subtle, kind of quiet indie movie that it's just more of a quiet sci-fi movie than a big laser guns in space.
I love those types of.
Yeah, I don't know how to describe the genre, but quiet sci-fi comes to mind.
Yeah, because those can be extremely powerful. There's another one that I've wanted to see, which I unfortunately haven't, but it's called Moon with Sam Rockwell. And I've heard a lot of great things about that, and that seems to be another one of those quieter science fiction movies.
Yeah, intellectual sci-fi. I would also describe it as that. And what's also cool about it is that the main actress also wrote and I believe directed the movie. So that's really cool because she's quite young, and I always like it when there are female writers and directors out there because you don't see a lot of them, and she's really good.
So here's the thing. We've already talked about Master and Commander and the fact that, we are definitely going to be doing a discussion on that. However, you have just said that your favorite movie is Amadeus.
Oh my gosh.
And that is in rotation for me with my like top 3 favorite, and very often it is at the number 1 spot.
Yeah.
There is probably no other movie that has been more important to like my development as not just a cinema fan, but a music fan as well, because I fell in love with classical music through that film, and it hit me at a very impressionable point where I think it was the 9th grade, and I saw it in school, except I remember we watched it over multiple days, and then we got to Friday and there were like maybe 5-10 minutes left of the movie and the bell rang and we had to stop, and I rented it over the weekend because I was like, no, I am not waiting until Monday.
Wait, now 5 to 10 minutes, was it like?
It was like right before
Mozart died?
Yeah.
Spoilers, Mozart dies.
Yeah. And it's so funny because I was such a nerd for that movie, because I actually would force my friends at that age to come over and watch it. And it's like
I did too. I forced my neighbors. I forced my babysitters.
The last thing kids at that age want to be forced to watch is a movie about Mozart.
Yeah. It's so good though.
But yeah, I love it so much. And so I'm sorry, but I'm dragging you back.
I will. Oh no! If you're doing a stream about Amadeus, I will definitely. I love Amadeus so much.
Yeah. Oh God, such a great movie. I cannot wait for that.
I feel like I don't even need to watch it again to refresh my memory because I've seen it so many times.
It's permanently ingrained in my head.
It is.
Question though, which do you prefer, the original version or the director's cut?
The director's cut. It adds context. I mean, I'll always take more Amadeus over less Amadeus. When the director's cut came out and I saw it, there are a couple scenes in particular that I'm like, oh, so that's why he's walking down the street drinking from a bottle of wine, because he stole it from this house that he was going to give lessons to. But
I will say there is one moment of performance from F. Murray Abraham, who plays Salieri, that is missing in the director's cut, which I love. It's like it's after he gives one of his speeches, and he's like, he's speaking to God, and he says, "I will ruin your incarnation," and then he gives like a kind of the laugh, like that's cut out of the director's cut because
interesting.
Because
I know what you're talking about, but maybe
the way it cuts to the next scene, so it's removed. So that's the only thing that the director's cut is missing that I'm like, oh, I wish that was still there. But otherwise, you're right. There is so much added character-wise, especially for Constanza.
Yes, like why she's so upset at Salieri at the end. I mean, she already has reason to not like him anyway, but you know why she really hates him.
Yeah, so I feel like the pros definitely outweigh any cons I have, and plus it's the only version that's currently available in HD, so I'm always going to watch that anyway.
Yeah.
But yeah, anyway, so I can tell we're going to have a lot to talk about.
Yay!
When the time comes, so we'll do that. But so thank you so much for coming on. This has been so much fun.
It's been a blast. Thank you so much. We made it through talking about Shakespeare for 2 hours. I think we sounded pretty smart too. We have to look some things up, but for the most part, we sounded pretty smart.
Hopefully. Go ahead and tell people where they can find you.
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter at Shakes of Thrones. I tweet a lot about Shakespeare and A Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones, and just whatever strikes my fancy in general as far as pop culture and things that I like. And I also have a YouTube channel, which has been grossly neglected of late, but Shakespeare of Thrones is where you can find me there. And you can listen to some essays that I've recorded on parallels in parallels between Shakespeare and A Song of Ice and Fire. And you can find those essays on my blog, shakespearethrones.com.
Yeah, and I have put all that stuff in the description, so go ahead and look in there, and you'll find it right there. And also, you will find a link to the trailer for next week's topic, which is Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, which is my favorite of the Harry Potter movies and probably my favorite movie of 2004.
That's my favorite of the Harry Potter movies too.
Yeah, it's so good. And I guess I'll go ahead and spoil what's coming up the week after that, because this should come as a surprise to no one. I'll be doing a discussion on The Dark Crystal: Age of Resistance, because Steven just refuses to acknowledge that it's a great show. So I'm having to do it on this channel, and I'm going to save the special guest for next time. I'll surprise you guys, but it's going to be a great guest. So, stay tuned. And for next week, I'll be joined by Hannah from Game of Owns. So super psyched about that. And yeah, that's it. And yeah, Steven. Yeah, I know. You guys are finally going to have to listen to it. And you better show up, Steven. But oh, that's great. I can't wait, Beth. Yeah, and as for I think you brought up what you should watch next. Go ahead and watch either, if you want to watch Amadeus, that's always a great choice. And even though that won't be coming up immediately, but definitely watch it, or watch The Dark Crystal: Age of Resistance, because it is a phenomenal show no matter what Steven says. Yes, I know. Okay, so that'll wrap things up. Thank you guys for
thanks everyone for joining us.
Yeah, it's been great. Please, I feel like this was just such a fantastic stream, so please share it far and wide, if you will, and so that more people can see this. And yeah, and if we have any new people watching, if you like what you saw, please like the video and subscribe. I'll be doing lots more streams on different movies and occasionally TV shows. So please go right ahead and spread the word if you liked it. So I guess that's it, and I will see you guys next week. Thank you once again for tuning in. Yeah, okay, bye.